It started with a conversation that felt almost casual. Joe Rogan, deep in another long-form podcast episode, brought up Hollywood's elite once again. The tone in his voice shifted. You ever notice how some people, no matter what they do or who they associate with, never seem to be held accountable? He asked his guest, then he dropped the name, Oprah Winfrey. A pause followed. It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but this time, something was different. Joe wasn't laughing. He wasn't just poking fun. He was genuinely bothered, and when Megyn Kelly joined the conversation days later on her own platform, the narrative exploded. Together, whether coordinated or not, they started unraveling a public image that, for decades, had seemed almost untouchable. Let's talk about Oprah, Megyn Kelly said firmly during her show. She's positioned herself as a moral authority for years. She's sold the American public a version of truth, healing, and empowerment. But what she's never done is explain her silence, or worse, her defense, when it comes to Harvey Weinstein. Weinstein, of course, is the disgraced film mogul whose decades of sexual assault and rape were finally exposed by journalists in 2017. He's since been convicted, imprisoned, and ostracized. But what many people still don't know is how deeply connected he was to some of the biggest names in the entertainment industry, including Oprah. Images had circulated online for years, Oprah smiling with Weinstein at award shows, hugging him, introducing young actresses to him. There was even the now infamous image of her at a party with him, her hand affectionately on his shoulder, with a young British actress, Katie Noble, standing beside them. Noble would later accuse Weinstein of sexually assaulting her. She also said that it was Oprah's apparent support of him that made her believe she could trust him. Rogan didn't mince words when talking about it. You can't just pretend you didn't know, he said. People in Hollywood knew. They all knew. It's not like this guy was doing this in secret. And when you're Oprah, with that kind of influence, with that kind of power, and you keep quiet or worse, help maintain the illusion that he's a good guy. That's not just complicity, that's betrayal. Kelly, on the other hand, zeroed in on the media silence around Oprah. The press will spend hours dissecting a tweet by someone on the right, she said. But Oprah, she's allowed to disappear into the shadows whenever it gets uncomfortable. There are no probing interviews, no serious journalists asking her the hard questions. Why not? It wasn't just Weinstein. The criticism extended to her relationships with other controversial figures as well. For example, Oprah had long promoted and elevated spiritual teacher John of God, even calling him incredible during her coverage of his alleged healing powers. Years later, he was convicted of raping hundreds of women. Again, Rogan brought this up. How do you go from putting someone like that on your show, calling him a miracle worker, and then stay silent when he turns out to be a monster? He asked. There's a pattern here. It's not just bad judgment. It's selling people a lie and never owning up to it. Some defenders rushed to Oprah's side, insisting she couldn't possibly have known what these men were doing. But both Kelly and Rogan pushed back hard. It's not about knowing every single thing, Megyn said. It's about credibility. If you're going to build a brand around truth and healing, then you need to apply that same standard to yourself. And if you make a mistake, you come clean. Oprah never has. Rogan chimed in during another episode with a guest, noting that Hollywood operates under a double standard. They'll cancel someone for a comment from 15 years ago, he said. But if you're rich, powerful, and know the right people, and your brand is useful, they'll look the other way. Oprah has benefited from that protection for decades. He continued, I'm not saying she's a villain, but I am saying she's not who she pretends to be. And that's a problem. What shocked many viewers wasn't that Rogan and Kelly were criticizing Oprah, but how much traction the conversation gained. Clips from both of their shows spread like wildfire across social media. Hashtags trended, comment sections lit up. People were divided, but a common theme emerged. Many felt like something hadn't added up for a long time. She always came off a little too polished, one user wrote on Twitter. Like she was selling something more than just wisdom. She was selling herself, another added. I used to think she was just this super kind person. Now I wonder if that kindness was just marketing. To be clear, Oprah has never been accused of committing crimes herself. But what Joe Rogan and Megyn Kelly were exposing, or perhaps re-exposing, was the narrative that has always surrounded her, that she is beyond reproach, morally superior, and above the fray of scandal. What they brought to the surface was a conversation about accountability, image crafting, and media protection. Why is it, they asked, that some figures get relentlessly investigated, while others are shielded by a halo of legacy and money? And as uncomfortable as it may have been, they weren't entirely wrong to ask those questions. Megyn Kelly, who has had her own battles with media bias and double standards, reflected on this irony. I've been vilified for far less, she sighed. But Oprah, who has stood next to predators and said nothing, she's held up as an icon. Why, Oprah has remained mostly silent on the criticisms. She's occasionally addressed the Weinstein issue in broad terms, saying she didn't know the full extent of his crimes. But for many, that answer doesn't hold water. Rogan summed it up in one pointed sentence. When you build $1 billion empire on trust, and then you turn out to be part of the system that silences victims, that's not just hypocrisy. That's dangerous. It wasn't a scandal in the traditional sense. No bombshells, no lawsuits, no criminal charges. But it was a shift, a conversation that many had tiptoed around for years suddenly burst into the mainstream. Joe Rogan and Megyn Kelly didn't expose a new crime. What they exposed was something perhaps more corrosive, the illusion of moral authority, carefully preserved by silence and complicity, and for the first time in a long time, people weren't afraid to question the icon.